Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Americans for Peace Now webinar. I'm Ori Nir, and with me is my colleague, Max Albert Deitch. Hi, Max.
Hello.
You're joining us today from Atlanta, right?
Yes, I am. Technically about 45 minutes north, but yes.
Okay, got it. So before we start, the two usual housekeeping notes that you're probably all familiar with. The webinar is recorded. The video will be posted on our YouTube channel and the audio on our podcast, Peacecast. And if we're already mentioning Peacecast, I'd kind of give you a quick alert to look for tomorrow's conversation, which I'll probably post sometime over the Thanksgiving weekend, a conversation with Professor Daniel Bartal, who's an expert on the psychology of the conflict, you can call it that. So that's the first comment, and the second housekeeping comment is that you are welcome, in fact, encouraged to ask questions. As you probably remember, the way to do it is to use the Q&A tool that's at the bottom of your screen, not the raise hand tool. And please keep your questions short. So we are honored today to have Eric Alterman as our guest. I'm sure that most of you know Eric or familiar with his name, whether because of his journalistic work or because of the many books that he has published. We're especially honored that Eric agreed to join us for a conversation on the actual day in which his new book was published. It's today. The book addresses an issue that is at the core of APN's mission, which is the debate inside the United States over Israel-Palestine, and we'll get to that in our conversation. Of particular interest to us is the recent and current shift in American public attitudes toward Israel, which again is I guess the main topic of the book. So Eric, hello, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you very much.
So I wanted to start by asking you to talk a little bit about the title and about the book itself. The title of the book, I should say, is We Are Not One, A History of America's Fight Over Israel. We are going to put a link in a moment in the chat to the book on Amazon. So I'd like to ask you two related questions. First, why the title? And second, why the book? What I mean by that is that my shelves, and I'm sure that your shelves, we can see them behind you, as you write in the foreword to your book, are loaded with books about Israel and its relationship with America. So what makes this book unique, special?
Well, the second questions, they're both actually pretty easy to answer for me because I spent a lot of time thinking about them. But the second one has a simpler answer than the first one. The second answer is that this is the only book that anyone's ever written about the debate itself. So it's not about how to solve the conflict. It's not about the conflict itself. It's not about U.S. Israeli relations or America's role in the Middle East or in a conflict between Israel and Palestine. It's about the debate in the United States over Israel and therefore over Israel-Palestine, but with a much heavier focus on Israel itself. So no one's written that book, and that's what I do. I write about discourse but not in a way like there's not much Derrida or Foucault in it. It's about discourse in a way that people actually experience it in the mainstream media and the conservative media and the left-wing media, but not in an academic way. As for the title, I'm very happy about the title. It took me a long time to come up with a good title. And this title does, for me, three things. One is, we are not one. By we are not one, I mean, first off, America and Israel are not the same place. They're not the same country. They have very different kinds of countries, in fact. I'm sure our listeners will be shocked to hear that Israel is a very small country in the Middle East, surrounded by Arab countries. That was founded in 1948. And America is a superpower. In fact, it's until recently the world's only superpower for a while anyway. And it stretches from the Gulf Stream waters to the valleys, from New York to California, 340 million people in it. And yet, many people, including most pro-Israel people argue in the United States, that there should be no daylight at all between the United States and Israel's foreign policy. And by and large, there hasn't been. By and large, the United States has supported Israel in every international fora, in everything Israel does. Every once in a while, it gets mad about some action taken by some Israeli prime minister. But basically, the United States is cool with whatever Israel does, even if it's against U.S. foreign policy, like the settlements, for instance. Doesn't like the settlements, but doesn't do anything about them. The second meaning of the second sharper meaning of the title is that Israeli Jews and American Jews are not one. They're very different. They have very different experiences in terms of their lives and how they've grown up and what is meaningful to them. And they've come to have very different politics. Israel has become a right-wing country. No argument about that. There's even in the last government, which was the good government compared to the current one and the previous one, it was 72% of people elected to the Knesset were conservatives, were right-wingers. And that was the good government. Now we got a much worse government, and the number's higher, I imagine. I don't know exactly what it is. So American Jews and Israeli Jews are not one. Israel is a red country. American Jews are a blue country. And third, American Jews are not one. American Jews have enormous differences, particularly over Israel. I would say that there's a slight advantage in numbers of the view of Americans for Peace Now and J Street over those of AIPAC and other legacy organizations, but that's not at all represented in the politics. We'll get into that. But in terms of the opinion polls that are published by Pew and by the polls that J Street pays for, most Americans do not support the settlement policy. They do not support aggressive actions by Israel. They certainly don't support Israel consorting with anti-Semitic governments or with Donald Trump. And yet about 25% of Americans do. And a lot of those 25% are very wealthy Republican funders. So they get a lot more for they're vastly overrepresented in American politics compared to most American Jews. They run virtually all the legacy Jewish organizations, and they are very powerful in Congress in a way that vastly, again, overrepresents their numbers. That's in part a function of the weakness of American democracy and the power of money in our system, similar to the way the NRA gets what it wants. So those are the three main ideas. Now, American Jews disagree on a lot of things, not just Israel, but particularly about Israel. And those are the three messages I'm trying to get across with this title. And then I go back to the beginning of the story, which goes all the way back to 1896 or 7, to Theodor Herzl and the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. And I tell the story of how we got from there to here.
So first of all, I'd like to echo Ori's congratulations on the new book. I mean, I've been a longtime admirer of your writing. I've read a bit of this one. It's excellent, unsurprising to all of us.
Can I just say it's a little surprising to me. I've written 12 books. I think they're all pretty good. I don't apologize. I like them. But I've never written a book that I feel like I've done everything I could, that it's 100% as good as it could be. And I've never really said, I'm really proud of this work in a way that I am of this one. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to say that.
So I've got two questions for you about it.
Oh.
You frame the whole discussion of we are not one as a starting point, but you said that it took you a while to get to the title. So did you approach the book with a thesis in mind, or just with a plan to explore the discourse and the debate?
You know, I've been writing the book. I signed the contract for this book in 2015, but I've been working on it in my head literally for 40 years. No exaggeration. I spent a semester at Tel Aviv University, 1980, right when the peace deal was signed with Egypt. Right afterwards, I took one of the very first Egged buses with my friends from Tel Aviv to Cairo, We caused a lot of trouble. We're lucky that we didn't screw up relations when we were in Cairo. And I had a great, Tel Aviv University had a great faculty in those days. It had Itamar Rabinovich and Shimon Shamir and Chaim Shaked and a professor named Goodfeld, who I became close with. Then I came back to college for my junior and senior years, and I wrote, and I was all ready to be a Jewish intellectual, a New York Jewish intellectual. And I discovered when I got there, and I was 20 years old, that this tradition of Jewish intellectuals had been hijacked by neoconservatives. That they were very well funded, that they had a lot of outlets, that they had their own magazines and columns and jobs and in Congress and so forth, and in Reagan administration, and they were wrong about everything. And I was angry about this. I felt like my place in the world had been taken away from me before I had a chance to claim it. So I looked into this, and I said, how did this happen? And I looked into the effect. I had this idea that it happened because of the '67 war, that everybody was against Vietnam because it was so stupid, and America was getting people killed and killing people for no good reason. And then Israel became part of the American empire by with its destruction of the Egyptian military and its occupation of these lands that had previously been Palestine and were kind of nobody really knew who they belonged to afterward. And they decided that, number one, military power was a good thing, and number two, that American power was a good thing because Israel needed America on its side. And so I looked for sort of a flip overnight on Vietnam. I did this honors thesis. It's pretty good. I looked at the 6 different intellectuals' writings about it, and I'm such a nerd. You can sort of tell by my sweater and my books that I saved my note cards for 42 years. And some of those note cards and interviews I did and research I did are in this book. I did the same thing 10 years later when I was getting my doctorate at Stanford, and I spent a year writing about the creation of the state of Israel and its effect on American liberalism. Now, the thing about anyone who has a doctorate knows there's really only one thing you're supposed to do with your PhD thesis, and that's prove that you know everything there is to know about it and the topic you're writing about, that no one has written anything that you're not aware of. With Jews, you can't do that. They write too damn much. There's too many Jews writing about Israel and liberalism and so forth. So I spent a year on it and I gave up because I said, this is not a dissertation topic. And I wrote my book about presidential lying. But I saved those notes too. And I've been thinking about it ever since. I've written many columns about Israel and the American discourse and criticized some of the people who are criticizing this book for years. I've taken some crap from American Jewish organizations as a result. So for some reason, this has been very dear to me, this topic, the relationship between Israel and American Jews, and between Israel and the United States. And again, I've written now 12 books. They're all kind of about the same thing, except the one that is about Bruce Springsteen. And I can make the case that this one is too. That one is too. They're all about how do ideas affect actual behavior on the part of nations. So that's what this book is too. It's about how does what Jürgen Habermas calls the public sphere, how does the public sphere translate itself into action so that it affects people's actual lives? And so that's what this book is, and that's why I feel like I know what I'm doing, because I've been at this topic and the topics that comprise it for 40 years.
Absolutely. So that leads into my second question, which is, you started working on this 40 some odd years ago. It's clearly something that's very near and dear to you. What surprised you as you started working on this one, working on it now as opposed to when you started?
I'll be honest. I suppose I should be prepared for this question and prepared to answer it, but Israel treated the Palestinian Israelis much worse than I understood before 1967. The Nakba is a real thing. We don't have the numbers, but I quote one document that has the IDF taking credit for expelling 700,000 Arabs before 1948, like leading up to 1948. And then they passed the law in 1950 where they expropriated all of their property and kept it for the state. And it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was until 1966 that they were living under martial law and couldn't go from one place to another without registering with the military authorities.
Right.
And this is the golden era of Israel before it was carrying out an occupation. So I was disappointed to learn how badly how to the degree to which Palestinian Israelis have always been second-class citizens, kind of an afterthought, and the degree to which Zionism, mainstream Zionism, wanted them to just go away. The talk of let's all be friends and let's build this country together. Some people believed it. Some people were dedicated to it, but not the leaders of mainstream labor Zionism. The other thing, this is going to sound a little both sidesy, but and it's kind of unfair to the Arabs, but man, they've had terrible leadership forever. Beginning in the 1920s, when the British offered them a deal that would have given them control over Palestine, with some participation by the Jews, and their refusal to even participate in the UN, with the UN UNSCOM, the commission to decide what was to be done when the British left in 1948, through the present, where the strategy is all about BDS, which is a terrible strategy. There's doing nothing for the Palestinians who need help. It's a shame that this quote keeps getting quoted because it's such a cliche, but they do not miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. That's a quote from help me out here, the UN representative
Abba Eban.
Abba Eban. Thank you. And now there are good reasons for this. We can talk about it if you want. The Palestinians have a real problem in terms of their competing constituencies, and the no is a lot simpler for them than the yes. But what I've discovered, I think I end the first chapter, the introductory chapter, quoting Aaron David Miller, who gives me a beautiful blurb for the book, and I never met him in my life, so I'm very proud of it. So there's never really been conditions for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. What you need is both sides really being ready to give up what they need to give up, and an American president who's willing to push them to do it. And we've never had all three things at once. So that's the other thing that I'm disappointed, well, that I learned. Most people think there could have been peace. We were so close. We were so close with, not necessarily Camp David, but with under Bill Clinton, when Arafat refused to accept Barack's offer, and then later on in the negotiations that followed that, and so close with the with the Camp David Accords, when at the White House ceremony, where, by the way, I was on the lawn that day, and I was incredibly moved and incredibly optimistic. But actually, we were never very close, and we're further away today than we've ever been, or at least as far away as we've ever been. So I came away, I'm sorry to say, because you're supposed to sound optimistic and give people hope, more pessimistic about both sides than I went in.
I'd like to ask you to comment on three terms that are often mentioned in relationship to the Israel-U.S. relationship, in relation to the relationship. Mm-hmm. One is, which you already mentioned before, the issue of daylight. And it may be a good opportunity to tell a little story here. The first time that President Obama met with Jewish leaders, they sat around the table. This was just shortly after he was I think shortly after he was elected. And at some point, the person who was then the head of the ADL said there should be no daylight between Israel and the United States. And President Obama said, why? He was surprised by this, which everyone was completely horrified by that. It was like something you're not supposed to say. So maybe a little bit about this issue of the expectation among American Jewish leaders and Israeli leaders that there should be no daylight. That's one term. The other is special relationship. When and how was this special relationship forged, and what were the building blocks of it? And then the third term is the issue of shared values, which has been regarded for many years as the foundation, like the ethos was that this is the foundation of the special relationship, the alliance, and we've been witnessing recently, I think, that there aren't that the shared values have weakened over time. So long question.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you guys can just take a break now. There's a lot to say.
Yeah.
Well, the issue of daylight, quote unquote daylight, is an odd one because, as I said, we are not one. They're a completely different country and with different interests. But Israel, there's a quote of Bibi Netanyahu that he said in private, but he was videotaped, unbeknownst to him. And he was speaking to a group of settlers, and he said, "Don't worry about America. America is a country that can be easily moved." And I think this has been the view of all Israeli leaders, that if you just wait out America, you'll get what you want, regardless of what Americans say or think they are going to do. And I think this has been true. It was even true under the only American president who ever took on Israel in public, which was Dwight Eisenhower after the 1956 war. He went on television and he said, "We're going to cut off all aid to you. Not only all aid, we're going to cut off all trade to you. We're not going to let Americans give you any money if you don't withdraw from Egypt." The French and the British withdrew immediately. The Israelis did not. The Israelis waited them out. And even though, again, he spoke about Israel in a way no American president ever has before or since, he caved on the main things, on the main demands that the Israelis were making. And by and large, if you look at all the fights that have made the headlines, the Israelis always get what they want from the United States. The story, you told a story about Obama. I'll tell a story about Obama. The beginning of the Obama administration, Ben Rhodes, who was his deputy national security advisor, came into Obama's office, and he had just seen a liberal Democratic congressman, and he was very upset. And he said, "Why?" He says, "Well, this guy's really upset because he's very uncomfortable with you demanding Israel freeze its settlements." And Obama says, "But he's against the settlements." And Ben Rhodes says, "Yes, but he's more against doing anything about the settlements." And I say that this began as a position of a liberal Democratic congressman who's not named, and it ended up becoming the position of the Obama administration itself. The Israelis, when they say we're not going to, we don't want to do something, they don't do it. It's one reason. I mean, it's impossible for me to imagine that the United States would ever try and force Israel to do anything that Israel saw it's fundamentally against its own security, like turn itself into a completely democratic country from the river to the sea, and therefore give the Palestinians a majority. It's impossible to me to imagine that America would ever demand such a thing. That's one reason I think BDS is ridiculous from a strategic standpoint. But it's even more impossible for me to imagine that Israel would do it if, in some other alternative universe, the United States did demand it. Israel is going to do what Israel thinks is best for Israel, and it will tell the United States to go to hell if it needs to, although it would prefer to do it quietly. So this issue of daylight is the way that that American Jewish leaders, quote unquote daylight, keep American politicians from overtly criticizing Israel, but they don't really have to worry about American leaders doing anything contrary to Israel's security because they're not going to do it anyway. There's no percentage in it. There's nothing to be gained by it. They can every once in a while express anger. When Begin annexed the Golan Heights, they were angry. When Begin attacked the nuclear plant in Iraq and ignored everybody's rights by flying over their airspace, American president was angry, but they didn't do anything about it. They got over it. Bibi Netanyahu's right about that. That's I can't remember the other two now. What were they? I'm old. What was the second one?
So we talked about a special relationship and about the idea of what was it then? Now I forgot.
All right, well, I'll do special
shared values. Shared
Okay.
values, the thing that I'm most interested in.
Well, special relationship is a very long story. I would say it began. It's always sort of been a special issue, but it began. The one we are living in now, I would say, began in the 1980s under President Reagan, when AIPAC, after AIPAC lost the fight over trying to prevent the U.S. from selling AWACS, this special radar system, to Saudi Arabia. It became, instead of a small but effective organization that mainly lobbied congressmen, it became a nationwide organization with grassroots and very public, and it became a lobbying powerhouse, so that along with the NRA and maybe the retired people's lobby, it's the single most powerful lobby in the United States. Certainly the most powerful foreign policy lobby that has ever been. And at the same time, the Christian conservatives, they always liked Israel. For a long time, when American Jews were anti-Zionist, the evangelical Christians were the pro-Zionist people in America. American Jews came around between the 1920s and discovered the Holocaust to becoming pro-Zionist. Before that, they were mostly anti-Zionist. But the Christians, evangelical Christians, have always been pro-Zionist. But in the 1980s, they became much more political and much more pro-Zionist. The reasons for that, are kind of disturbing. They're looking forward to the Book of Revelations, when Armageddon takes place and all Jews go to hell and they are lifted to heaven. But in the meantime, they're cool with whatever Israel does. And so they came to prominence in the 1980s, and so did the neoconservatives, who never conquered American Jewish politics. They've always been a minority of no more than 30%. But they were able to speak on behalf of American Jews to American Christians, as if they represented American Jews, and they took the same positions that the American Jewish organizations took, which is that Israel is always right. And the media, this is one of my many criticisms of the mainstream media, they treat these people as if they speak for American Jews. So around the same time, in the 1980s, the rabbis were kicked off the stage as Jewish leaders and replaced by the head of the AGC, the head of the President's Coalition, the head of AIPAC. And so these people created this sort of iron. What is it? Avi Shlaim, who wrote the book The Iron Triangle, he had a different definition of it. But these people define what was responsible to be able to say about Israel and Palestine. And what's so interesting to me is that you could get in so much trouble if you went beyond the borders, but the borders were always changing. So President Kennedy was not allowed to say the word Palestinian, according to his advisors. And President Carter was not allowed to say the word Palestinian homeland. He caught hell for that. And Andy Young, President Carter's Black representative to the UN, the most high-ranking Black person in the cabinet, lost his job and was kicked out for meeting with the PLO, which he was doing actually on behalf of Israel. It's a complicated story, but an interesting one. And those were the only people that could deliver peace. It's ridiculous. And Jimmy Carter was against the policy that said that they couldn't talk to the PLO, but Kissinger has made this promise to the Israelis, and the American Jewish organizations were enforcing it. And so Andy Young was forced out of the administration, very much to the detriment of Black Jewish relations and the future of American liberalism. And there's always been a conflict between American Jews' liberalism and their Zionism. And until recently, the Zionism has won. And this is one change, and I guess it leads to your next point. Now the liberalism is winning. And that's one reason why Israel is becoming far less popular than it's used to being with Democrats, and particularly young Democrats, who are the most liberal group in the country, and Jews. So that's what's changing. The other part of it now, this idea of shared values. Well, for a long time, Israel would just win the argument by saying we're the only democracy in the Middle East, number one, and number two, our Arabs have life much better than any other Arab. So even though they're not equal, would they rather go live in Syria? Is that what they want, or Libya? And now we know that Israel is not, who am I quoting when I say Israel is democratic if you're Jewish, but Jewish if you're an Arab? So
Yeah,
it's
this
not,
is the Knesset member Ahmed Tibi said that.
okay,
Yeah.
it's a smart thing to say. It's not in the book, but it's the book. So it's not a democratic country for if for 20% of its citizens. And most Americans, I think until recently, probably today, had no idea that that figure is so large. I mean, Black Americans are only 12% of the United States, and it was a terrible crisis when they were not given their rights, and people really care deeply about this. And yet 20% of Israelis have very limited rights. They can vote, but they have very limited rights in other ways. And particularly if you include Jerusalem as part of Israel, those people, 350,000 people, do not have political rights the way Israeli Jews do. So it's a democracy with a very big asterisk next to it. Now, the thing is that historically, Israelis have looked and felt like Americans. They don't look like Arabs. They don't look like, you know, they don't look foreign. They look other. They look like us. And in fact, they look better than us. You know, we had this idea of the founders of Israel, out of the movie Exodus, really, where Paul Newman was the avatar. But you know, they would work in the fields in the morning, and then they would argue about Dostoevsky and philosophy in the afternoon, and then they would go and fight in the evening, and then make love to their girlfriends at night, and then do the same thing the next day. They were Ubermensch, they were Supermen, and they were different kind of Jew. They were a Jew that American Jews fell in love with. You know, they were not Philip Roth Jews. They were these Leon Uris, imaginary Jews. And American Jews loved that. They lived vicariously through these Israelis. But then, beginning in 1977, with the election of Menachem Begin, it became clear that this was no longer Israel. Israel became a lot more like America. I went to Israel the first time in 1974, and I a 14-year-old, and I fell in love with this idea too. And the idea that out of the ashes of the Holocaust came this new, proud, strong, virile Jew was just wonderful. Everybody loved it. They loved it before 67 when they had this, they didn't think about it much, but they had this sort of Disneyfied, later Exodusized view of Israel. And then they continued to love it for a long time. Again, the power of the Holocaust has remained very strong for a long time. And the idea of Israel being beleaguered, a small country surrounded by a hostile power. But that has by and large disappeared. So David has become Goliath and vice versa in today's world. And so the idea that shared values hold either American Jews and Israeli Jews together, or America and Israel together, that no longer holds water at all. Because you know, Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump have shared values, but we hate Donald Trump, we American Jews, and most Americans hate Donald Trump. I think I quote Natan Sharansky and Gil Troy saying Israelis are angry at American Jews because they love Trump, and the American Jews are angry at Israeli Jews because we love Obama. American Jews loved Obama. And that's just not, that's not a coincidence. That's very real. Israel is the only democratic, quote, country in the world that preferred Trump to Obama and preferred Trump to Biden. And that's the exact opposite of most American Jews. So Israel has shared values with evangelical Christians and with Orthodox American Jews. And that's important. I don't quite do justice to this in the book. Today, 10% of American Jews are Orthodox. And this is ultra-Orthodox. There are not that many. Modern Orthodoxy is disappearing in America. But they have, I read a statistic that they have 40% of the babies in New York now. So the mainstream secular American denominations are in crisis. Conservatism has lost a third of its membership in like the past 15 years. And Reform Jews have lost about 15%. They would have lost more, except that conservative Jews are becoming Reform. Young people are disappearing from both. And I think a big reason for that is that the mainstream organizations have become Zionized. Not that they're people are object to support for Israel, but that's all they do. They've replaced the things. They've replaced theology. They've replaced social justice. They've replaced social service. They've replaced thinking about what it means to be a Jew in the diaspora with support for Israel, Holocaust remembrance, and anti-Semitism. And there's no substance to that. There's no reason to be Jewish anymore. There used to be. It worked for me when I was born in 1960. And when my Bubby and Zeta and my parents said to me, you got to support Israel because of the Holocaust, I got it. And people my age, up to my age, got it. Maybe a little younger than me got it. But now people don't get to say, why do I support Israel? I said, they're palling around with Orban in Hungary and the Brazilian guys, Bolsonaro, Trump. I don't want anything to do with that. And the Holocaust, well, yeah, the Holocaust was terrible, no doubt about it. But so are a lot of other things been terrible. And what about Cambodia in the 1970s and other mass murders? What about Bosnia? And I'm not comparing these things to the Holocaust; they're all their own things. But the idea that what happened in Germany in the 1930s and 40s and in Eastern Europe should dictate a person's identity today, it's not compelling. It's not convincing. And to be honest, while there is an upsurge of anti-Semitism in the United States, some of it, a great deal of which, by the way, is attributable to people who are angry about Israel, there's really no problem with being Jewish in America the way there once was. There are no barriers really. Anyway, we Jewish politicians, Jewish lawyers, Jewish presidents of universities. It's fine to be Jewish. It's not dangerous to be Jewish in America. It's as good as anything. We're totally part of the establishment today. So the idea that we need a refuge from anti-Semitism is not convincing either. So what Israel rests on today, politically speaking, is the support of Christian conservatives and the support of the political system, which to some degree rests on the donor base, which is quite conservative for these Jewish organizations like AIPAC, and the fact that the political system is very slow to respond to democratic. When it comes to foreign policy, I wrote a book about democracy and foreign policy almost 25 years ago. In fact, 24 years ago. There's very little democratic impact on U.S. foreign policy, and it certainly would take a long time before it reaches down into Israel. So for all the talk, I'm sorry, giving such a long answer, but for all the talk about the Democratic Party, it's no longer on Israel's side, and the Squad, it's a danger to Israel. Well, when you had, after the war, the 2021 war in Gaza, and after the United States had signed a $38 billion memo of understanding with Israel over a 10-year period, Congress decided it wanted to give Israel another $1 billion on top of the $38 billion to make up for the money spent on the Iron Dome missile system. What was the vote? It was 8 votes against, 1 abstention from AOC, and 538 minus, so 499. 529 for. So that's the danger Israel faces now, that it might be 510 against 20 one day. But the political system is still very much in Israel's court, even though this idea of shared values is a thing of history.
So you've touched on this a bit already, but there's a chapter in your book titled Coming Unglued, which, and again, you've talked about this a bit, suggests that the big break among non-conservative Americans and Israel took place under Donald Trump's 4 years in the White House, and then within that, the close association between that very conservative Netanyahu-led Israel and the Trump administration. I'm gonna take it from your last answer that is a correct depiction, but what do you think happened during that period, particularly among progressive American Jews, in terms of that separation? And then I have a follow-up for that as well, but I'd like to give you a chance to answer that first.
I think, the threat of Donald Trump, if you would call Donald Trump a fascist shortly after he was elected, you'd be considered ridiculous. You'd be outside of responsible discourse. But he was a sort of homegrown American fascist. We learned, he tried to overthrow the election violently, as well as any other way he could think of. And this was the greatest threat America has faced to its democracy since the Civil War, and we still face it. So American Jews they're Americans first in most cases. I'm not talking about myself, but I'm saying the Israelis, by the way, have contempt for American Jews, in part because they think they're just sort of playing at Judaism. And they'll either be assimilated into Christianity, or they'll be anti-Semitism will frighten them into giving up their Judaism. But it's a separate issue, although one we should probably talk about. But Donald Trump was terrifying, and still is. And the fact that Israel didn't care about American Jews' most fundamental political concern, and just allied themselves with this evil threat to what American Jews held most dear. Like I said, before Trump, you could sort of balance your Zionism and your liberalism, but under Trump, you no longer could. And Trump himself says this. He says, "What are you American Jews doing by not supporting Israel?" Because I support Israel and the Democrats don't. And Netanyahu he's remarkably similar to Trump. He's a lot smarter than Trump. He's not nearly as crazy as Trump, but he's just as focused on his own political movement, which is every bit as racist and exclusionist and potentially violent and certainly corrupt as Trump's is. So they have very similar interests. They also weirdly have sons who are even, if possible, more offensive than they are. I don't mention that in the book, but I'm mentioning that today because I saw a tweet from Yair Netanyahu that was really nice to Kanye West yesterday. Anyway, so the alliance between Netanyahu and Trump really made this very stark, because Trump is the enemy of 75% of American Jews, enemy in a way that no Republican president has ever been since the founding of the state of Israel. He's an enemy of not just our party, but our most fundamental values, and of our country's democracy, and Israel's leader and Israel's population embraced this and bought into it. So this made an unbridgeable break between Israel and the majority of American Jews. And today, this week, as of the past week, that break has broken out into the mainstream discourse, because Israel is bringing in these Israeli government appears to be bringing in these really objectionable people into the government, objectionable parties who are, pro-terrorist, and they talk about expelling the Arabs from the country, and the issue over the killing of Palestinian American journalists is another issue that is demonstrating that the break is now out into the open. So this coming unglued, when I wrote that chapter and I called it that, it was more about how the politics in both countries were simultaneously coming unglued. Netanyahu was obviously so corrupt, but he was getting away with it because he had such strong support. Trump, same thing. But it has this double meaning now that the relationship is coming unglued because of Israel is moving further and further in this extreme direction. The United States, we don't know what's going to happen, but clearly American Jews and American liberals and the people who have always been there for Israel can't go along with it. The head of the reform movement, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, he issued a statement about Ben Gvir, et cetera, that no American Jewish leader has ever said before about Israel. It was much harsher than anything they've ever allowed themselves to say in the past. And the thing hasn't even happened yet. If it does happen and the Israelis take that direction, that they seem to be going on, then we're going to see a dislocation between the two that has no precedent.
Sure. So that was the follow-up, is where do you think this reality might be headed, considering what I've sort of been referring to as the extremification of politics?
That's
Israel's
a good word.
election, a sort of return to a conservative Netanyahu-led Israel with more controversial, further extreme leaders. I think the question in the chat about Orthodox community being the fastest growing Jewish population in the US is relevant in there as well.
Yeah, I haven't looked at the chat. I've been focused on our conversations. I will, though, once we turn it over to questions. So listen, so Joe Biden, when it comes to Israel, he's definitely a man of the past. When the Democrats had their primaries, his two competitors, Joe Biden was the only one of the top three, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who said, we will never condition aid to Israel on its behavior. We're going to give them the aid. They can do what they want. We're not going to use aid as a lever to get them to stop building settlements or stop letting the settlers beat up Palestinians who are trying to plant olive groves or whatever. When Biden goes, that will be a thing of the past in the Democratic Party. That's now a mainstream position to say, Israel's the only America gives military aid to a lot of countries. Israel's the only one that doesn't have to account for how it's spent. That's one of the great victories of AIPAC, et cetera, that Israel gets the most amount of American aid, military aid, and yet they do whatever they want with it. Every other country has to account for exactly where that military aid went. So in the future, Israel, that relationship, that aspect of the relationship will change. Now, under Biden, Biden's election coincided with Bibi losing the last election. And everybody was thrilled that they didn't have to deal with Bibi. And I quote I forget who it was, a columnist, I think on Eric, who said that the Americans were terrified of this bear in the basement. And they did everything they could to avoid opening the door so that the bear could get out, and then they'd have Bibi back. So the Bennett government was able to really do whatever it wanted without the Biden administration making any kind of public problem with it. They said, please don't build in Area C. They said a few other things, but they basically turned a blind eye to what was going on in the West Bank with the settlers. So with Bibi in power and the Democratic Party having no sympathy at all for Bibi, and even worse, to the right of Bibi, there will be a lot of conflicts, and it will be just like everything in America, which will be, the Trump and Republicans party will attack the Democrats and call them anti-Semites, while at the same time exploiting anti-Semitism, and the Democrats will be divided. And the American Jewish organizations will, by and large, come down on the side of Israel, and therefore lose more and more support among Democrats, and particularly young Democrats. And I'm a historian, so you're not going to get me to predict the future, but because anything could happen, who knows? But clearly, these two trends are not going anywhere. The trend that Israel is becoming more and more of an extreme right-wing country, and the United States, American Jews are moving to the left. Young American Jews, young Israelis are more right-wing than their parents, and young American Jews are more left-wing than their parents. And so are young American Democrats and young American people. That's why Democrats held on to the Senate, because of young people, Generation Z. So these two trends are embedded in the world. Something could change it, but nothing looks like it's about to, and you can expect a great deal more conflict. And just to add on to this, I think this is worth thinking about. In none of these, I can't find a single example where Israel changed its policy or view because American Jews said don't do it. Sometimes the American government would say don't do it, although that's pretty rare too. But American Jews, there's a famous quote when Golda Meir who was prime minister at the time, met with American Jews, and because Golda Meir's government was supporting Nixon, and American Jews were supporting McGovern, and they were unhappy. And Golda said, "Where are your Phantom jets?" It's just like when Stalin said, "How many troops does the Pope have?" So Israel, I think, will continue to get what it wants from Congress and from the presidency because they control the levers of power, number one. And number two, because the Palestinians are so bad at politics. At least they're so bad at American politics. They have no levers to power. And the Palestinians themselves in the West Bank and Gaza, Israel's ace in the hole is, you're asking us to make peace. Make peace with who? They're right. The Palestinian Authority is illegitimate. It has an election in 16 years. It's corrupt. It has very little support. You can't make peace with Hamas. I agree with that. So the Israelis have this opportunity, and they're using it to make sure that peace, instead of making sure that they're creating the conditions for a lasting peace that they can live with. And I think again, predictions, but I think history will look back on that as enormously short-sighted.
I'm looking at the clock here, and we're kind of approaching the end of our conversation. There are a couple of things that I wanted to ask you before. I want to make sure we don't leave out. So I'm looking at the questions that are being asked in the Q&A. We're not going to be able to address all of them. One of them, and some of them reflect the kind of a ruffling of feathers of some of our participants. Well, one is asking, why do you think that BDS is ridiculous? Why did you refer to it as ridiculous?
Well, BDS has, I think, one main value, which is it tells the Palestinians, we haven't forgotten you. We're thinking about you. Israel is, the Arab world has basically moved on. It's fine with what Israel does, but the Palestinians have, no real friends, diplomatically speaking. But there's a group of people who really care, and we're going to march for you. We're going to protest on your behalf. But that's it. BDS has no theory of actually improving the lives of Palestinian people. Again, BDS says we're going to conquer American politics, and then America is going to force Israel to turn itself over to a Palestinian majority. Never, 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 never. I'll give anyone 1,000,000 to 1 odds that doesn't happen in any of our lifetimes. The most recent poll numbers, first of all, most Americans have never heard of BDS. 4% of Americans support BDS, 2% support it strongly. That's after 14 years. Again, it has a few academic organizations, it has a few left-wing magazines, no labor unions, no corporations, no local governments, certainly no national governments. The Israelis don't even notice it from an economic standpoint, if you want to compare it to the South African boycotts. So, and no supporter of BDS can explain to you how it's actually going to work. They all say, well, people have to get on the right side of history, or look at South Africa. They're the only two things you ever hear. I've spent a lot of time trying to get really smart people to tell me, how do you expect BDS to work? Now, I spent a few hours once in a refugee camp in East Jerusalem. It was the worst place I've ever been in my life, and my life was threatened. The Israeli soldiers who let me in said, "You're crazy to go in there," and I kind of was. But there was feces and urine running in the street, and kids with snot coming out of their nose, dressed in rags. It was horrific. Now, I care about these people. I mean, I won't saying they're my main concern, but I don't want those people. This was a long time ago. It's the 1980s. So those are the grandparents of the kids who are being born now, who are still living there, and whose grandchildren will also be born there. And BDS and the Palestinian movement does nothing for these people. Now, again, I'm sympathetic to the Palestinians contemporary today for the following reason. Like I understand why they refused the relatively generous offer that Barak made relative to previous offers and later offers. Palestinians have impossible constituencies to solve. Now, if Arafat had wanted to make that deal with Clinton in Camp David with Barak that he was being offered, he was told that he better not by the leaders of both Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and then he probably imagined he'd be assassinated if he tried. So that sort of took it off the table because Israel wasn't willing to part with the parts of Jerusalem that the Arab world felt it needed for a deal. But even if so, you've got that constituency. Then you've got the people I just described living in refugee camps. Then you've got the people living under occupation. Then you've got the people living in exile who aren't allowed to come back to their homes, but would like to and are just trying to make a living either in the Gulf states or the United States. And you've got people who are living quite comfortable lives because they've settled down for generations or they have good educations and good jobs. And they talk about Palestine and how beautiful it was and their gardens of their grandparents and so forth, but they don't really want to go back. They want to have an identity with Palestine, much like American Jews talk about Israel who don't want to go live there. So these constituencies are impossible to satisfy simultaneously. And so just by saying the only way you can keep them together is by saying no, because then you don't have to deal with their competing needs. And so this is one reason why I think peace is impossible for the future. That the concessions that would be made to help the people in the refugee camps are the people who I think are most desperately needing help, or the people living under an increasingly brutal occupation by Israel and at the mercy of these horrific violent settlers of late. These people are kind of a secondary thought. And the BDS movement, which has marches on campus and speeches at meetings of professors and editorials in the Harvard Crimson, what does it do for these people? It's not, it's not, America is not going to demand ever that, it's nothing like South Africa. You can call this, we haven't talked about the word apartheid. Probably it's best not to talk about it because it's complicated and you need a lot of time for it. But Israel is nothing like South Africa. And the BDS movement is nothing like the global movement that helped force South Africa to turn over its country to its oppressed majority. So I'm extremely critical of the Palestinian leadership and Palestinian supporters for embracing it on the one hand. On the other hand, you might say to me, Eric, well, then what should they do? I don't have a good answer. I mean, I do have an answer. They're not asking me. I think a strictly nonviolent movement could be very successful because American Jews were horrified by Rabin's policy of breaking bones when they were throwing rocks in the first Intifada. And I think if they had like a strike like we had in civil rights movement in Birmingham, and all the Arabs stopped working and just sat down, and the Palestinians sat down and said, "Go ahead and hit us, whatever. We're not, we want our rights. We want a one man, one vote." I think that the world wouldn't let Israel. The world might, and American Jews might say to the Israelis, "We can't live like this anymore. We can't support this." It might work. It's the only thing I can think of. But I'm no expert on Palestinian psychology or Palestinian politics. The book, I should say, is much improved by a reading I got from Dr. Hussein Ibish, who read it quite late, but explained a lot of things to me that I wouldn't have otherwise understood. But I think the power of machismo in Palestinian and Arab life would make such a thing impossible. And that the idea of resistance and fighting back is so ingrained in Palestinian life that even though it has no hope of improving their lot, and in fact is certain to make it worse, because Israel is always going to respond, many times over. Nevertheless, it's fundamental. So I look at the situation. That's what I've learned. I've learned that American Judaism needs to save itself. That the Israelis are not. The Israelis are not. They're not really interested in what American Jews think. And American Jews, whatever you think about Israel, maybe everything Israel done is absolutely necessary and correct, and it's fine. it's still it's still a vicarious experience for American Jews that is not consistent with with the way they live, and the meaningfulness of Jewish life in America has suffered for its wholehearted embrace of Zionism alone. Now, I think it was probably almost certainly the right thing to do in the 1940s. There were hundreds of thousands of refugees that had nowhere to go. The only way they could go is if you created a state in Israel. I get it. I'm with them. The Ikhud movement was not realistic, but at some point, American Jews had to recognize the fact that they were living entirely different lives than the Israelis, and that the heroism that they witnessed was not their heroism. It was somebody else's heroism, and they needed to chart their own path. And the intensity of the embrace of Zionism and the Holocaust have stood in the way of that. And so, to the degree that I have a conclusion as an American Jew rather than as a historian, that's my conclusion, that American Judaism has been hollowed out by its embrace of Zionism, and that it needs to save itself quickly, because, like I said, the numbers have been disappearing, and they're worse among young people than any other. So that's sort of my, to the degree that I have anything optimistic to say, is that I think that many American, particularly young American Jews in rabbinical academies and cantoral students, that they're realizing this, and American Jewish leaders are finding a new path. Young future American Jewish leaders, they're being resisted by contemporary American Jewish leaders, and that'll be a very interesting struggle in the future.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, and thanks for ending with some, with a conclusion. I was going to quote, but we're out of time. I was going to quote the beautiful quote that you are quoting in the conclusion to the book of Joan Didion, where she talks about what the discourse about Israel is like in the United States. But I'll leave it for the reader, for the participants, for them to explore when they read the book.
Right, they've got to read the whole book to get to that, because it's the very last sentences
right.
of the book.
Yes, I very much recommend it. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. I want to wish you and all of the people who joined us today a happy Thanksgiving, and hopefully we'll host you again later on.
It was a genuine honor for me, and I really appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate the work of Americans for Peace Now. I joined it, I think, when I was in college, when the soldiers first came to the United States for the very first time from Shalom Abshab, and I'm thrilled to have this opportunity as having written this book. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And
okay.
Thank you everyone for joining. Goodbye now.